Hi everyone, and welcome back. Today we're in my little home art space, and this has sort of been my place of zen over the last few months of extremely hard science projects, most of which I can't talk about just yet. And these are my creations. It has been so much fun making these, but there's one significant problem with them, and that's what we're going to talk about in this video. You see, the issue is what they're made of, and that's a material called monster clay. Monster clay is simultaneously a dream and a nightmare, and it was the material I settled on when I first started sculpting a couple of months ago after watching, frankly, way too many hours of Jazza videos. It starts off as this really firm, hard to manipulate material, but throw it in the microwave for a couple of minutes and it becomes soft and malleable. It'll even totally liquefy if you heat it up enough. As it cools, it firms up again, allowing you to carve in fine details. Monster clay is just sort of a name brand of an oil clay, and oil clay is exactly what it sounds like. It's clay that's been hydrated with oil instead of water. This means that it never dries out, so I can do a little sculpting, walk away, come back, do a little more sculpting, and I'm never worried that it's going to have dried out and is now ruined or I can't keep working on it, which is really good because I don't have a very long attention span and only tend to work in about half-hour bursts. But that benefit comes at a pretty significant and obvious cost, which is that they're never really permanent sculptures. They always remain soft, so it doesn't take a lot of effort to dig your fingernail in and ruin some of the details. Or say, what happens if this gets knocked off the shelf and falls? It's now flattened, and my sculpture is completely ruined. Also, it being oil clay, not a lot of paints actually stick to it very well. So as much as I would love to give these a beautiful paint job, I literally can't do that. So the only way to get around this is I'm going to have to make copies of these in some harder material that's also nice and paintable, which means that I'm going to have to learn how to make high quality molds so I can make resin copies of these easily. This has the added benefit that two of the other projects I'm working on require very complex molds, so this is sort of a great excuse to bumble my way through this, buy a bunch of casting materials, and try them all out before I have to do something important, and learn a skill which is very much more art than science.
Well, sometimes science is more art than science, Morty. A lot of people don't get that.
The whole process was a humongous mess and chaos from the first moments, but I think you're really going to love the end results. Here's some of the models that we'll be casting today. These two look a little bit rough because, well, I'm filming this after I've already made the molds, but I've got a bust of Groot and the head of the Angel of Death from Hellboy. This one, the one in the middle, is Davy Jones, but I think he's just too noodly to make really good molds from, so instead, this one I'm going to be 3D scanning, but that's going to have to be a topic for another video. I've also got this really cool alien antlion grub from Half-Life Alyx. To make this, we extracted the low poly model directly from the game, and then I re-sculpted it in Blender to re-add the details so we could 3D print and paint it. I'm planning to make a silicone copy of this that I can fill with soft robotic structures to make it wiggle around and look realistic. But today, we're just going to make the mold and a basic solid silicone copy as a proof of concept. And finally, we've got my friend Vesta, and I'll be making some Alginate molds of her hands. I'm making a set of Spider-Man-esque wall climbing gloves, and she's the only member of the team light enough for them to work, and I need casts of her hands so the gloves will fit perfectly. But we're going to start with Groot. Before I started, I watched a couple of mold making tutorials, and so with overwhelmingly misplaced confidence, I decided I'm going to start with the hardest thing first, which is a silicone mold with a hard shell. Specifically, my plan was that I was going to cover Groot in a silicone shell, and then build a two-part plaster hard case around it to support the silicone. That plan went to shit immediately. I started mixing up silicone for the first layer, but it was my first week using a new camera rig, so I didn't realize that it wasn't actually recording. So as I'm sitting doing an operation that literally cannot be repeated and putting the first layer onto Groot, the camera just sat there staring at me. So that footage is lost to the deep old ones, but I managed to fix the issue for the second layer. I'd used really nice runny silicone for the first layer, but I wanted to conserve as much silicone as possible and also thicken everything up really fast. So I added a thixotropic agent to my next batches of silicone, which made it almost into a sort of spreadable paste. See how it's all spiky? Those lumpy cracks are hard to fill and make it really hard to notice small holes or thin spots in the mold. I should have just stuck with runny silicone for at least 2 or 3 more layers before doing this, if at all. Anyway, I did a few more layers until I thought things were sort of covered well enough, and then I started mixing up some plaster for the shell. I used plasticine to make a sort of border that for what was supposed to be the seam of the two-part mold, but I didn't have enough, so I was stretching it thin, and this wasn't really a good material choice to start with. To add reinforcement, I'd soaked strips of cloth in the plaster and used that to help build up the shell of the mold, but I don't actually think this helped at all. Eventually, I'd added enough plaster that I thought the half was done, and at that point I just let it dry. At that point, I flipped it over and used sort of an oily rag as a barrier to prevent the two halves sticking together, and then added all the same sort of plaster on the other side to make the other half of the shell. But when it dried and I tried to demold things, everything just kind of crumbled apart, and a lot of the plaster was hooked into all of that spiky silicone, so it was almost impossible to get it off without destroying everything. At this point, I really just wanted Groot back out of the silicone because I realized I'd made a pretty big error, and I was feeling pretty bad because I loved my sculpture and I didn't want it ruined. So I just started cutting the silicone apart. And as I was doing this, the silicone was ripping, and I thought just everything was ruined. The clay was really stuck in the silicone too. This is why his sort of crown thing looks weird now. And I was kind of mortified and panicking. But as I kept working on it, I realized that all of the pieces of the mold were actually still there. It was in tatters, but I did have all of the detail preserved. So I figured, well, I mean, it can't get any worse. So I just used an enormous amount of green tape to make a sort of shell and kind of gently hold all of the silicone in the correct-ish place, and then used a few zip ties to reinforce it some more. Before I actually show casting this and pouring the resin in here, I'm going to show making the mold of the angel head because I ended up casting them at the same time, so it's the only way this footage is going to make any sense. I think I may have overcompensated in the other direction with this one because I used a lot of silicone. First up, I made a box out of foam core that would fit around the sculpture, and then I just mixed up a gigantic batch of silicone.
Ooh. Ah. Oh. Jeez. Oh, man. Did you see that?
A recurring theme that you're going to notice throughout this entire video are these two facts. I always underestimate the amount of mold making material I need, and I overestimate how much resin I need. Once the silicone had set, getting the sculpture back out turned out to be a little bit of a challenge. Basically, the problem is that when I watch the tutorials on how to do this, they always show cutting in sort of a zigzag pattern, which isn't really super easy to do when you have a gigantic block of silicone. So the end result of this is as I'm trying to do my zigzag pattern, I'm just cutting chunks of the mold out. But thankfully, I so vastly overcompensated with the amount of silicone that I had used, the chunks that went missing were only part of the wall of the mold and not any of the actual detail, which was very lucky. To actually cast both of the sculptures, I chose Easyflo urethane resin, which has a whopping 2-minute work time. So the idea is that it's water thin because you're not going to have nearly enough time to degas it and get all the bubbles out. So this way it's thin enough, the bubbles will just kind of come out, and you just have to work really fast. Get the stuff mixed, get it in the mold, and get done. Which is a problem when I overestimate the amount of resin I need, so I've got basically double what I needed. Now I've got a pot of resin in front of me, setting, and no idea what to do with it. Thankfully, I remembered I still have the Groot sculpture to process, so I ran over and grabbed it so I could dump the rest of the resin into the Groot mold. Unsurprisingly, fitting with the theme of the video, this is where even more chaos started. You see, the silicone mold had loads of holes in it, both from the places where it ripped or where it was too thin and there were just little micro holes. Point is, it was a thing that was being held together with painter's tape, so all of the resin immediately starts draining out of the top of his head. But I wanted the mold to look good, so I started tipping the mold and trying to rotate it so that the resin would coat the entire inside of the mold, which caused resin to just go everywhere. At which point, the rational thing to do would be to just sort of invert the mold, let it drain, come back to it later. This is not what I did. I grabbed the bucket of resin, poured it back in, and did the whole process some more, which got even more resin on even more things. But end result ended up coming out pretty good, which we'll look at in a moment, so what's a little mess? Okay, now the fun part. We can actually demold these. First up, the head. Oh, it's really warm. Oh, there's the flashing.
Right on the face.
Yeah, but it comes right off. This is great. For Groot, things were a fair bit trickier. In the places that the resin had leaked through the silicone, it hardened between the tape and the silicone. But after using a pair of snips and then just a little pick to fish out tiny bits of silicone that had gotten stuck in the cast, I had a remarkably good Groot cast and an absolutely ruined mold. From both of these experiences, I learned that I needed to put a lot more thought into the molds before I made them. So for the grub mold, I busted out all the stops, not for the least of reasons that of all of the molds, I do actually need this one to be reusable because I'm going to use it again, and it needs to be good the first time. So care and patience in advance. First, I chose my materials carefully. I want the end result to be silicone, so I obviously can't use silicone as my mold making material. So to get around this, I used urethane rubber instead. This has the added benefit that it is able to mold silicone. It has the added problem that it interferes with the curing of silicone. So I had to specifically choose a urethane and silicone that was compatible. In this case, a tin silicone and reoflex urethane rubber. As I do every time, I made a box out of foam core, but this time I took a bunch of time to make a barrier out of monster clay around the grub to block off half its surface. I also added bumps of clay to act as registration pins once this first layer of urethane is poured. I will say I have been spoiled by silicone up to this point. Urethanes smell so much worse and are just so much more toxic and just a nightmare to be around, but it was the only way I could figure out how to do this, so you gotta do what you gotta do. But the actual mechanics were exactly the same. Mix the two parts, pour it into the mold, and wait. The silicone I'd been using up to this point had a 25-minute demold time, which was awesome because it meant I could do a lot of layers in one day or just get generally a lot of work done. Whereas the urethane had a 16-hour cure, so I had to just leave it overnight. The next day I cut away the drips and then flipped over the mold and tried removing the clay. But the monster clay was so firm at this point that I couldn't actually get it back out and had to remove the walls of the box just to get a proper grip on it. But then at that point it popped right off, leaving a perfect half mold and grub behind. To make the second half, I first added some more clay to the two spots that will be the fill and air escape channels. Then I rebuilt the box and hit everything with a good spray of mold release. Then I mixed up another batch of urethane and just poured it on top. The next day I cut it all apart, which took a surprising amount of effort. But when I finally got all the foam core off and started to pry, to my astonishment, I was greeted with an absolutely perfect mold of the grub. It fits back together really nicely because of the registration blobs I added earlier. So I immediately mixed up some of the tin silicone to make the grub. I wasn't expecting how thick this stuff was going to be, so getting it into the mold was a little bit of a challenge. First, I tried a funnel, but eventually just switched to a syringe with the end cut off to quickly transfer silicone back and forth until the mold was full. The next day is where the chaos returned. As soon as I touched the mold, I realized the silicone was still goopy and not actually set properly. I was terrified that I'd ruined the mold, so rather than taking a breath and, say, reading the package on the silicone, I just cracked the mold open immediately. First, the good news. The silicone grub mostly popped right out and was 90% set, just maybe a bit sticky. So the mold is definitely reusable. But it was only at this point that I checked the box and realized that this is a 24-hour cure, not 16-hour cure silicone. The bad news is twofold. First, there was a tiny hole in the mold, and it allowed enough silicone to leak out that the grub was missing part of its back. And it wasn't actually set enough before I removed it, so part of the legs broke off in the mold. I'm going to let this fully set, clean it up, and in the grub video we'll give this another go. At least the mold works, so I hopefully won't need to remake it. Okay, one more mold to make and cast, and then it's on to paint. Alginate is one of the weirder materials of the list, insofar as that it comes as a powder that you activate by adding warm water to it. The nice thing is, alginate really at its core is essentially refined kelp, so it's completely skin safe, which makes it perfect for making casts of body parts. The first time I tried this, it failed pretty spectacularly. I made a foam core box, just like I had every other time, but I didn't actually think through what was about to happen, which is I was about to put, let's say 10, maybe 15 pounds worth of alginate and water into a foam core box held together by nothing but hot glue. Unsurprisingly, this went exactly how you think it would go. The box gave way, spraying alginate absolutely everywhere. Alginate has a 5-minute pot life, which means you really gotta work fast once the water's been mixed in. So we just kind of panicked and scooped up as much of the alginate as we could, dumped it back into the bucket, and Vesta just jammed her hand into it and we called it good enough. But I wanted to do it properly because I do actually need a mold of her arm almost up to the elbow so that the gloves will fit perfectly. So we took a little bit of time, thought it through, got a better container, and tried again. Same deal as before. We mixed up some alginate, poured it into our container, realized we underestimated how much we needed, mixed up some more, poured it into the container, and then Vesta got in position, stuck her hand in, and we waited the 2 or 3 minutes for the alginate to set up.
Suction.
Alright, go for it. Carefully. Oh, I hear it farting. Oh. Oh, that was good. There you go. Good shit. High five.
For making the cast, I switched to a different brand of resin that is the same idea, just cheaper and from a different company.
Oh yeah, 700 was way more than I needed. Why do I keep making this mistake? I needed 500. That sucks.
But it's also the way you do resin.
Yeah. Oh, it all just set. Literally, the whole thing just went in 1 second. Check it.
Yeah.
I poked it with the stick and it all set.
Oh, is that satisfying?
Remarkably, yeah.
Oh, wow.
Oh yeah.
Does it look like a hand?
Oh yes it
Oh,
does.
yeah.
It's very warm. Like very, very, like almost hot
Oh, yeah.
on the inside. Best hand!
I will say it feels pretty weird holding plastic that has accurate human skin texture, and there's also just something about holding a perfectly anatomical hand that just feels weird. I don't know, it's like weirdly personal. Don't really know how to explain it, just sort of a weird feeling. But with that, all of our casts are done, and now, finally, the part I've been waiting for, paint. If there is one thing I've learned through all of my different art escapades, it's this one fact. Art always goes through an ugly phase. And really, just coming to terms with that is the real secret to making good art. You just know it's gonna look like shit for the first bit, and you push through and keep working on it, and eventually it starts looking good. But rather than listening to me blather on, let's just enjoy these statues, which at this point I've spent dozens of hours on, finally come to life. This project has been so much fun, and I absolutely love how all of these turned out. I'm gonna have to build some shelves so that I can display it properly with the rest of my art. Which, by the way, if you don't recognize the paintings from the one time I showed them before on the channel, these are all of mine. If there's one theme that's run through this entire project, other than maybe chaos, it's been one of learning. I can legitimately say that I am much better at mold making now than I was at the beginning of this process, and I think I'm actually ready to tackle the Spidey gloves and healing pod, and I think that's going to be a lot of fun. But you don't actually need hundreds of dollars worth of casting and molding materials to learn. In fact, you don't even need to stand up. All you have to do is check out the sponsor of this video, Brilliant. Brilliant is an amazing online learning platform that I think really stands out because of how interactive it is. As you saw, I love hands-on stuff, and Brilliant's ever-growing catalog of lessons captures that nicely. Even the simplest lessons become so much more engaging, and they cover all sorts of science and math topics. I always struggled with math classes because normally they're so tedious, but the little things like this adjustable tangent demo just add that little sprinkle that helps keep it fun. And the courses are full of things like this. I normally recommend a specific science course, but they've been revamping their logic course and I would highly recommend it. Get started for free by clicking the link below or going to brilliant.org/thethoughtemporium, and the first 200 people will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. Before I wrap up, I want to say a special thank you to my many patrons, channel members, and various supporters. I know this is the first video that I've posted in a little while, but that's not because I haven't been busy. The projects I'm working on are just really hard and huge, but I think you're really gonna like them. But I want to say a special thank you for sticking around, as your support goes a long way to help make these videos possible. And if you'd like to help keep the flow of science videos coming, there's some links below.
But that's it for now, though. As always, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, and ring that bell to see when I post new videos. And be sure to check out my other social media pages to see these projects long before they end up in videos. That's all for now, and I'll see you next time.